Okay, in this video, I'm going to walk you through parts 3 and 4 of the obstacle game project. After that, I'm going to have you work on the rest by yourself, but I at least wanted to get you started with the vertical enemy to show you what kinds of things you'll need to be doing with the other classes that inherit from enemy. So part 3, we are going to be programming, well, part 4 is the vertical enemy part. Part 3 is just this small part talking about inheritance. So the inheritance hierarchy here, what's the superclass of vertical enemy? Well, of course, that's enemy. A subclass of vertical enemy is diagonal enemy. And um, hopefully you can make sense of why that would be the case, why we would have diagonal enemy as a subclass of vertical enemy. Think about how the vertical enemy is going to move and why diagonal enemy would also be considered a vertical enemy. Remember, we can have diagonal enemy act like a vertical enemy and then add on to that as well. How many methods will the enemy subclasses inherit from enemy? The answer to that is all of them. So all of the methods that are in the enemy class, I think there's like 5 of them. How many fields will the enemy classes inherit? The answer to that is just 1, because there is only one field in the enemy class, which is just the rectangle itself. Now the rectangle object is private to the enemy class, but that doesn't mean that the subclasses don't inherit it. They still have that property, but the way you have to access it is through getters and setters. And then answer number 13, how many constructors do the enemy subclasses inherit? The answer to that is 0, as we've discussed. Subclasses do not inherit constructors. They can call and actually have to call superconstructors, but they don't inherit them. All right, so let's actually get into writing a little bit of code for this project. We're going to be coding the vertical enemy first. So I'm going to switch over to my project and go to the vertical enemy class. So the very first thing you need to do is make sure that vertical enemy actually is an enemy. So that's the whole point of this chapter, is this extends thing. If I don't type extends enemy, then this vertical enemy class is just completely separate and won't have any stuff inherited. Next thing we need to do is look at what the constructor is going to look like. You can look at where the vertical enemy is created, which is in the commented section down below here. There it is. So in lines 111 through 114, that's where the 4 enemies are created. So you can see the constructors that are being called there. We have to actually write this constructor. 1, because vertical enemy doesn't have any constructors. 2, because it doesn't inherit any constructors from enemy. And 3, the constructor of this class is different than the enemy class anyway, because it has additional parameters. So with that said, we're going to flip over to the vertical enemy class and write a constructor for that class. All right, it is going to have 6 parameters. So there is the x value, the y value, the width, the height, and then, so those are all just things that all enemies need to have. And then we're going to include 2 more properties, which is the screen height and the Y speed. Okay. Now we talked about how the rectangle itself is stored in the enemy class, which means we need to send all this information to the enemy class. You remember how to send that upwards? Call the constructor of the superclass. We type in super and then just pass along the information. Here are the 4 things required to make an enemy. And my code just disappeared. So let's try that again. Okay, once we pass all that information up to the superclass, then we need to store the additional information in this class, which means this class needs two additional fields. So those fields will be a screen height and a speed, because we're going to tell this enemy how fast it's going to be going up and down. So store those in our fields. And we're good to go. Okay, at this time, I'm going to go into the obstacle game. I'm going to uncomment the code that creates a vertical enemy, make sure it works, and run it. It takes a while to get going, but there it is. So the blue rectangle is the player, the green rectangle is the goal, and now we have an additional rectangle, which is a black vertical enemy. Now, as you're going to see in the assignment, vertical enemies are not supposed to be black. That's just the default color. If you want to try and move around your player, make sure you're clicked in the window here, and you can move your player around. Okay, if you run into the vertical enemy, which is not moving yet, you do lose. Okay, so I'm going to hit stop. How do we get our vertical enemy to move around? Remember that the enemy class has a move method, but it does not do anything. So we need to override that move method. So I'm going to be safe. I'm going to type in override to make sure I get the signature of this method correct. And then what a vertical enemy needs to do is it needs to change the y value of the rectangle. Okay. So this is really important because you have to do this with all of your classes. First, you have to get the rectangle of this enemy. So I'm going to store that rectangle locally by calling this, or rather super dot get rectangle. That get rectangle method is in the enemy class. It allows us to access the rectangle object so that we can change its properties. So in this case, what property are we going to change? We're going to change the Y property. For rectangle objects, there aren't methods. You have direct access to the variables. Instead of being private fields, they're public fields. So we can just change them directly. In this case, I'm going to add the Y speed to the value of Y. This is how the Y speed is how much we want to change the Y by. Okay. Now, if you run this right now, it's not going to actually do anything. For some reason in Replit here, we need to actually compile these classes that we change ourselves. So in this case, you need to go Java C down here in the console. You got to go Java C and then the name of the class, vertical enemy.java. If there are any compilation errors, if you made any syntax errors, it should tell you those errors right now. But you're going to have to do that, unfortunately, every time you make changes so that those changes are reflected in the running program. I'm not sure why it doesn't compile those and update them for you, but it doesn't. So there you go. If you caught it, the rectangle moved off the screen because we were changing its Y value, and it is gone. So now the next step is, well, I need to make sure it bounces. So how do I know if it bounces? There's a nice diagram in the instructions here of checking this. If it hits the bottom, that means that the bottom of the rectangle has hit the bottom of the screen. So to check that, we're going to go if the Y value of the rectangle plus the height of the rectangle, because it's not the Y value of the rectangle is the top of the rectangle. We're not checking to see if the top of the rectangle hits the screen. We're checking to see if the bottom of the rectangle is hitting the screen. So that's where we're going to go rectangle Y plus rectangle height, like they show here. And if that value exceeds the screen height, remember height and Y values are measured from the top left up here. So they're getting more and more positive as we go downwards. So if that exceeds or equals, whichever, the screen height, that means that we need to get our rectangle moving in the opposite direction. Now we're always adding the speed to it. So what do you think we should do to this speed so that the direction reverses? We should reverse the speed. So to do that, we'll just do times equals -1. So that'll change our y speed from a +5 to a -5. Now this is going to get it to reverse directions. We also need to check to see if it hits the top. I think you can handle that yourself. But let's make sure this works before we move on. So once again, I typed in that Java C vertical enemy.java down at the bottom in the console to update the code from this class. Then I hit play, and this time we should see it bounce off the bottom and then go back to the top. And then it's going to disappear off the top. All right, so that's part 4 or most of it. There's still some things you need to clean up here. You need to change the color of the enemy and get it to bounce back and forth all the time. All right, good luck.